She was lost searching for food in a snowstorm until an Apache hunter lit a fire she'd never forget. What happened next changed everything she thought she knew about survival, trust, and the thin line between civilization and the wild heart of the American frontier. The Blizzard's Grip, Colorado Territory, February 1881. The storm had been building for 3 days, transforming the Rocky Mountain foothills into a white wasteland that swallowed landmarks whole and turned familiar paths into death traps. Abigail Carson pressed her face against the frosted window of their one-room cabin, watching the snow pile higher against the doorframe with each passing hour. At 19, she had lived through harsh winters before, but nothing like this. The wind howled like a living thing, rattling the cabin's crude wooden walls and sending ice crystals through every gap in the chinked logs.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
Her father, Thomas Carson, lay on the single cot they shared, his breathing shallow and labored. The fever had taken hold of him 2 weeks ago, and without proper medicine or food to restore his strength, he was slowly wasting away. Their supplies had run dangerously low even before the storm hit. Now, with the blizzard raging outside, they were down to their last handful of beans and a small piece of salt pork that wouldn't feed a grown man for more than a day. "Abby," her father whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind's constant roar. "The storm's got to break soon. When it does, you need to get to Morrison's trading post. Tell them I'll pay double when the snow melts." He coughed violently, specks of blood staining the threadbare blanket. "Promise me you won't try to go out there while it's still blowing." "Promise me." Abigail nodded, though her heart was already racing with desperate plans. Morrison's trading post was 8 miles through treacherous mountain terrain under the best conditions. In this blizzard, it might as well have been on the moon. But watching her father's ribs show more prominently each day, seeing the way his eyes had begun to sink into his skull, she knew that waiting for the storm to pass might mean waiting too long. The Carsons had come to Colorado Territory 3 years earlier, part of the wave of settlers drawn by promises of cheap land and mineral wealth in the mountains. Thomas Carson had been a carpenter back in Missouri, skilled with his hands and full of dreams about building a homestead in the wilderness. He had chosen this remote valley specifically because it was far from the railroad lines and the mining camps, believing that isolation would mean safety and self-sufficiency. What he hadn't counted on was how quickly isolation could turn from blessing to curse. The nearest neighbors were the Morrison family, who ran a small trading post and supplied the scattered homesteaders with goods from Denver. Beyond that, the only other inhabitants of the region were scattered bands of Ute and Apache hunters, who moved through the mountains following game trails that had existed for centuries before white men ever set foot in Colorado. Abigail had learned to handle a rifle, trap small game, and preserve meat for the winter months. She could identify edible plants, navigate by the stars, and endure hardships that would have broken most women her age who had remained in civilized society. But all of her wilderness skills seemed inadequate when faced with the raw fury of a mountain blizzard that showed no signs of ending. The cabin itself was a testament to her father's carpentry skills, built with interlocking logs and a stone foundation that kept it stable even in the fierce winds. But it was still just one room, barely large enough for 2 people, with a stone fireplace that devoured their dwindling wood supply, and a single window that provided the only natural light. The roof was solid, but snow had been accumulating on it for days, and Abigail could hear occasional groaning sounds that suggested the weight was testing even her father's skilled construction. By the 4th morning, her father had not spoken for hours. His breathing had become irregular, sometimes stopping for long moments that made Abigail's heart race with terror before resuming with a rattling gasp. The last of their food was gone, except for a few spoonfuls of beans she was saving for when he might be strong enough to eat again. Her own stomach had stopped growling and settled into a constant, gnawing ache that made it difficult to think clearly. The storm outside seemed to be weakening slightly. The wind still howled, but not with the same relentless fury of the previous days. Snow continued to fall heavily, but Abigail thought she could see slightly farther than before through the white curtain that surrounded their cabin. It wasn't much of an improvement, but it might be the only chance they would get. She made her decision with the cold clarity that comes from having no alternatives left. If she stayed in the cabin, they would both die slowly of starvation, while her father's fever consumed what little strength remained in his body. If she ventured out into the storm and failed to reach help, at least her death would be quick. But if she succeeded, if she could somehow reach Morrison's trading post and bring back food and medicine, there was still a chance to save them both. Abigail began her preparations with methodical care, understanding that every detail could mean the difference between life and death. She dressed in layers, starting with the wool undergarments her mother had knitted before dying of pneumonia 2 winters earlier. Over that went her heaviest wool dress, then her father's spare shirt and coat, and finally an old buffalo hide coat that a trapper had traded to them the previous summer. She wrapped her feet in extra wool socks before pulling on her boots, then tied strips of leather around the outside for better grip on ice and snow. For navigation, she had her father's compass and a rough map he had drawn of the local area, based on his conversations with other settlers and the occasional trading expedition. The map showed the general direction to Morrison's post, but it was far from precise, and she knew that landmarks would be invisible in the blizzard. She would have to rely on the compass and her own sense of direction, developed through 3 years of living in these mountains. She packed what little remained of their supplies: a small knife, some matches wrapped in oiled cloth, a coil of rope, and a tin cup. There was no food left to take, which was precisely why she was making this desperate journey. She left their remaining firewood stacked beside her father's cot, along with a note explaining where she had gone and when she hoped to return. Stepping outside the cabin was like entering an alien world. The familiar landscape of their homestead had been completely transformed into an endless expanse of white drifts and shadowy hollows. The storm struck her with physical force, wind-driven snow pelting her face like tiny needles and instantly making her eyes water and blur. The cold bit through her layers of clothing as if they offered no protection at all. The first 100 yards were the most difficult as she struggled to establish her bearings and get accustomed to moving through snow that varied from ankle-deep to waist-high depending on how the wind had sculpted the drifts. Her father's compass became her lifeline, though reading it required stopping frequently to wipe snow from the glass and shield it from the wind with her body. Each reading had to be taken quickly before her fingers became too numb to hold the instrument steady. Navigation became a constant battle against the storm's attempts to disorient her. The wind seemed to come from all directions at once, carrying snow that limited her vision to just a few feet in any direction. Several times she found herself walking in circles, recognizing her own footprints in the snow and realizing she had been deceived by the shifting patterns of drifts and shadows. The psychological impact was almost as dangerous as the physical challenges, as doubt and panic threatened to overwhelm her determination. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes according to her father's pocket watch, Abigail realized she was already in serious trouble. Her feet had gone numb despite the extra socks and leather wrappings, and ice was forming in her hair and on her clothing from her own breath and body heat. Worse, she was no longer entirely certain she was heading in the right direction. The compass reading seemed consistent, but in the white maze of the blizzard, consistency was no guarantee of accuracy. The terrain began to change as she moved away from their homestead valley and into the forested foothills that lay between her and Morrison's trading post. The trees provided some relief from the wind, but they also created new dangers.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
Snow had accumulated heavily on the branches, creating unstable loads that occasionally crashed down without warning. The forest floor was treacherous with hidden roots, fallen logs, and sudden drop-offs that were invisible until she was stepping on them. Moving through the forest required a different kind of navigation. The compass was still essential, but she also had to pick her way carefully through the maze of trees, often detouring around impassable thickets or steep slopes. Each detour carried the risk of getting turned around, and she found herself stopping frequently to take new compass readings and try to calculate how far off course she might have wandered. The psychological effects of the forest were profound. The trees created a sense of enclosure that was both comforting and claustrophobic. She felt slightly more protected from the wind, but also more isolated and vulnerable. The silence between wind gusts was deeper and more ominous, broken only by the occasional crack of a tree branch under the weight of snow or the distant howl of what might have been wind or might have been something far more dangerous. Her physical condition was deteriorating steadily. The exertion of moving through deep snow was exhausting, and she had to rest frequently despite the risk of losing body heat. Her hands had become so numb that she could barely feel the compass, and several times she dropped it in the snow and had to search frantically to find it again. Her feet were completely without sensation, and she was beginning to stumble more frequently as her body's ability to maintain balance was compromised by cold and fatigue. By her watch, she had been traveling for 3 hours when she admitted to herself that she was lost. The compass still pointed north, but she was no longer confident that she had maintained the correct heading through all her detours around obstacles. The forest had become denser, and she suspected she might have wandered into a different drainage system entirely. The snow was still falling heavily, and her own tracks were being filled in behind her, eliminating any possibility of retracing her route back to the cabin. The realization brought a moment of pure terror that threatened to paralyze her completely. She was alone in a blizzard, miles from any shelter, with no food and rapidly diminishing physical reserves. If she made the wrong choice now, she would die, and her father would die as well, slowly and alone in their cabin. The weight of that responsibility was almost crushing, but it also provided the motivation she needed to keep moving. She tried to think logically about her situation. Morrison's trading post was somewhere to the north and east of their cabin, probably no more than 10 miles in a straight line. She had been traveling for 3 hours, which should have covered at least half that distance, even in difficult conditions. If she was lost, she couldn't be too far off course. The key was to pick a direction and stick with it, rather than wandering aimlessly and exhausting herself completely. The forest began to thin slightly, suggesting she might be approaching a ridge or clearing. This could be either good news, meaning she was making progress toward her destination, or bad news, meaning she was climbing into even more exposed and dangerous terrain. But it was also her first real landmark since leaving the cabin, and she decided to treat it as a positive sign. What Abigail didn't know was that she had wandered into territory that had been hunted by Apache bands for generations. The forest she was struggling through was crisscrossed with game trails and hunting camps that were invisible to her eyes, but clearly marked to those who knew how to read the signs. The storm that was threatening her life was merely an inconvenience to hunters, who had learned to survive in these mountains through centuries of accumulated wisdom. Esno had been tracking a small herd of elk when the blizzard intensified, forcing him to abandon the hunt and seek shelter in a cave he had used many times before. At 26, he was considered one of the most skilled hunters and trackers in his band, capable of reading signs that other men couldn't even see, and surviving in conditions that would kill most people within hours. He had been living in these mountains since childhood, first learning from his father and grandfather, then developing his own techniques through years of solitary hunting expeditions. The cave where he had taken shelter was well stocked with supplies he had cached over multiple seasons: dried meat, warm furs, tools, and weapons. He had enough provisions to wait out the storm comfortably, and his knowledge of the local weather patterns told him it would likely break within another day or two. He was in no danger, but he was also restless, unaccustomed to being confined. Even in relative comfort, it was his restlessness that saved Abigail's life. Despite the storm, Snow periodically ventured out from his cave to check conditions and look for signs that the weather might be improving. On one of these excursions, moving silently through the forest despite the deep snow, he noticed something that didn't belong: human tracks, but not the tracks of anyone who knew how to travel properly in winter conditions. The tracks told a story that was immediately clear to his experienced eyes. Someone, probably a woman based on the size of the footprints, was wandering through the forest in a blizzard without proper equipment or knowledge. The tracks wandered erratically, showing multiple changes of direction and evidence of frequent stops and falls. Whoever was making them was in serious trouble and probably didn't have much time left. Snow followed the tracks for nearly an hour, moving with the swift efficiency of someone who could read the terrain even in a blizzard. He found Abigail collapsed against a large pine tree, barely conscious and showing clear signs of severe hypothermia. Her lips were blue, her skin was pale and waxy, and she was shivering so violently that he could hear her teeth chattering from several feet away. She looked up at him with eyes that were glazed and unfocused, clearly not processing what she was seeing. In her condition, his appearance might have seemed like a hallucination or a fever dream. He was dressed in traditional winter clothing made from tanned hides and furs, his long black hair braided and decorated with small feathers and beads. His face was marked with the geometric tattoos that identified his clan and status as a hunter. To Abigail's confused perception, he might have appeared as a spirit or vision conjured by her dying mind. "Help me," she whispered, the words barely audible through her chattering teeth. "My father... he's sick... need food... Her voice trailed off as another wave of shivering overwhelmed her ability to speak. Snow didn't waste time with words she probably couldn't understand anyway. He could see that she was minutes away from losing consciousness completely, and once that happened in these conditions, she would be dead within the hour. He scooped her up in his arms, surprised by how light she was and alarmed by the way her body felt like ice even through her layers of clothing. Her head lolled against his shoulder as he began moving swiftly through the forest toward his shelter. Snow carried Abigail through the driving snow with the sure-footed grace of a man who had navigated these treacherous slopes since boyhood. His destination was a natural cave formation that his grandfather had shown him 15 winters ago, a place where generations of Apache hunters had sought refuge from the mountain's fury. The cave entrance was cleverly concealed behind a curtain of ice-covered pine boughs, invisible to anyone who didn't know exactly where to look. Inside, the cave opened into a surprisingly spacious chamber that extended deep into the mountainside. The walls were smooth granite, worn by centuries of water flow, and the ceiling rose high enough that a man could stand upright without stooping. Most importantly, the cave was completely dry and naturally insulated from the bitter cold outside. Near the entrance, a circle of blackened stones marked where countless fires had been built over the years. Snow had prepared this shelter with the methodical care of a master survivalist. Thick buffalo hides covered the floor, creating an insulating barrier against the cold stone. Bundles of dried grasses and pine needles were stacked against the walls, ready to serve as kindling or bedding. Clay pots held precious supplies, rendered bear fat for fuel and medicine, dried berries and nuts, strips of jerked meat wrapped in waterproof bark. Everything was organized with the precision of someone whose life had often depended on being able to find essential items in complete darkness. He laid Abigail on the thickest pile of furs, immediately noting that her shivering had become weaker and more irregular. This was a dangerous sign. The violent shivering of early hypothermia was the body's attempt to generate heat through muscle activity. When that stopped, it meant the body was shutting down non-essential functions to preserve the vital organs. Without immediate intervention, she would slip into unconsciousness and death within minutes. Esno's hands moved with practiced efficiency as he began the delicate process of saving a life that hung by the thinnest of threads. First, he built a fire using techniques passed down through generations of his people. He arranged dried grass and shredded bark in a careful nest, then struck flint against steel with swift, precise movements. The sparks caught on the first attempt, and he gently blew on the tiny flame until it grew strong enough to ignite larger pieces of kindling. The fire was only the beginning. Esno knew that applying heat too quickly to someone in severe hypothermia could cause dangerous shifts in blood pressure that might stop the heart entirely. Instead, he began with indirect warming, positioning the unconscious woman close enough to feel the fire's warmth, but not so close that her frozen skin might burn, without her being able to feel it. Next came the removal of her wet clothing, a process that required both speed and respect. Her outer garments were stiff with ice, and he had to cut some of the frozen leather lacings with his knife. Underneath, her wool dress was damp with sweat that had frozen against her skin. He worked carefully, preserving her modesty while ensuring that no wet fabric remained against her body. Each piece of clothing was hung near the fire to dry, creating a barrier of warming fabric between her and the cave's entrance. He wrapped her in the warmest furs he possessed, including a magnificent wolf pelt that his father had taken during his own legendary hunting expeditions. The furs were layered strategically, with the softest rabbit skins against her pale skin and the thicker bear and elk hides providing insulation on top. He positioned heated stones from the fire's edge around her body, wrapped in leather to prevent burns, creating pockets of controlled warmth. For the next 6 hours, Esno maintained a constant vigil beside the unconscious white woman. He monitored her breathing, checked the pulse at her wrist and throat, and watched for any signs of improvement or deterioration. Her skin gradually changed from the waxy white of severe hypothermia to a more natural pink, and her breathing became deeper and more regular. But she remained unconscious, lost in whatever dreams or visions visited those who walked so close to the spirit world. During the long hours of waiting, Esno studied his unexpected guest with the careful observation of a hunter assessing unknown prey. She was younger than he had first thought, probably no more than 20 winters, with the kind of pale skin that spoke of European ancestry. Her hands, though soft compared to Apache women's, showed calluses and small scars that indicated she was no stranger to hard work. Her hair, now dry and spread across the furs, was the color of autumn leaves, something he had never seen on a human head before. Her clothing, once he had examined it properly, told him much about her circumstances. The garments were well made, but showed signs of careful mending and long use. This was not the clothing of a wealthy settler, but of a family that made do with what they had. The fact that she had been wandering alone in a blizzard suggested desperation rather than foolishness. In his experience, white settlers rarely ventured into dangerous territory unless they had no other choice. As the hours passed, Esno prepared for the moment when she would awaken. He brewed a healing tea from pine needles, wild mint, and dried berries, creating a warming drink that would help restore her strength. He also prepared a simple meal of softened jerky and pine nut cake, foods that would be easy for a weakened stomach to digest. Most importantly, he rehearsed in his mind how he would communicate with her when she regained consciousness. Esno spoke 3 languages fluently: his native Apache tongue, some Spanish learned from traders and raiders, and a handful of English words picked up during occasional interactions with white settlers. But he had never attempted to have a meaningful conversation with a white woman, and he suspected that her education probably didn't include any native languages. Communication would be a challenge that might prove as dangerous as the hypothermia. if it led to fear and misunderstanding. He had seen what happened when frightened white settlers encountered Apache warriors unexpectedly. Even when the intentions were peaceful, panic and cultural misunderstanding could quickly escalate into violence. The woman he had rescued was in no condition to flee, but her reactions when she awakened could determine whether this rescue became a tragedy or something else entirely. While she slept, he practiced simple English phrases, trying to remember the words he had heard traders use. Safe, help, no hurt. These seemed like concepts he should be able to communicate. He also prepared visual aids, arranging his supplies in ways that would demonstrate his peaceful intentions. The food and medicine were placed where she could see them immediately. His weapons were moved to the far side of the cave, visible but not threatening. Abigail's return to consciousness was gradual, like surfacing from deep water. First came the awareness of warmth, a luxurious sensation she had almost forgotten during her desperate journey through the blizzard. Then came the realization that she was lying on something incredibly soft and comfortable, far removed from the hard wooden floor of her family's cabin. The air smelled of pine smoke and something else, something wild and unfamiliar. When she finally opened her eyes, the first thing she saw was the dancing light of a fire casting shadows on stone walls. For a moment, she wondered if she had died and awakened in some kind of afterlife. Then she became aware of another presence in the space, and she turned her head to see a figure sitting cross-legged beside the fire, watching her with dark, intelligent eyes. Her first instinct was terror. The man sitting beside her was clearly an Indian, dressed in traditional clothing and decorated with what she recognized as war paint or ceremonial markings. Every story she had ever heard about Indian raids and captives flashed through her mind in an instant. But as the initial shock subsided, she realized several things that didn't fit the narrative of danger she had been taught to expect. He was not holding any weapons, and his posture was relaxed rather than threatening. More importantly, she was warm, dry, and obviously cared for. Someone had removed her wet clothing and wrapped her in luxurious furs. Someone had built a fire and maintained it while she was unconscious. Someone had saved her life when she was dying in the snow. Safe, Esno said carefully, using one of the English words he had been practicing. He gestured to himself and then to her, trying to communicate that she was in no danger. Help. No hurt. His pronunciation was accented but clear enough to understand. Abigail tried to sit up, but waves of dizziness and nausea forced her to lie back down. Her body felt like it belonged to someone else, weak and unsteady after her ordeal. "Where am I?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Esno pointed to the cave around them, then gestured toward the entrance where the sound of wind and snow could still be heard. He made a motion with his hands that she interpreted as describing the storm, then pointed to her and mimed the act of carrying something. Slowly, the basic facts of her rescue began to penetrate her confused mind. The next few hours were a delicate dance of communication and trust building between two people who shared no common language but were bound together by circumstances neither had chosen. Esno demonstrated his peaceful intentions through actions rather than words, offering her small amounts of the healing tea and watching carefully for her reactions. Abigail's initial fear gradually gave way to curiosity and grudging gratitude. She began to observe her rescuer with the same careful attention he was paying to her. He moved with fluid grace, every gesture economical and purposeful. His hands were strong and scarred from years of outdoor work, but they were gentle when he helped her drink or adjusted the furs around her shoulders. His face, when not shadowed by firelight, was younger than she had first thought, probably close to her own age. Communication evolved into a mixture of simple English words, gestures, and drawings scratched in the dirt floor of the cave. Esno drew pictures to show her the storm outside, her own tracks in the snow, and the location of his cave. Abigail, in turn, tried to explain about her sick father and their desperate need for food and medicine. The concept was difficult to convey, but she could see understanding dawning in his dark eyes. When she attempted to stand and immediately swayed with weakness, Esno gently but firmly guided her back to the furs. He pointed to the storm sounds outside, shook his head, and made sleeping gestures. The message was clear. She was not strong enough to travel, and the weather was still too dangerous for anyone to venture outside. As the day wore on and her strength gradually returned, Abigail found herself drawn into a strange form of conversation with her rescuer. Using their limited shared vocabulary and an increasingly sophisticated system of gestures, they began to share fragments of their stories. Esno told her, as best he could, about his life as a hunter. He showed her his various tools and weapons, explaining their uses through demonstration. His bow was a work of art, made from mountain sheep horn and sinew, with arrows fletched with eagle feathers. His knives were crafted from traded steel, but fitted with handles carved from elk antler and decorated with intricate beadwork. Each item told a story of skill, patience, and connection to the natural world. In return, Abigail tried to explain her family's situation. She drew pictures of their cabin, her sick father, and their empty food stores. She showed him the calluses on her hands from farm work and household tasks, trying to communicate that she was not a helpless city woman, but someone accustomed to hard work and self-reliance. She could see him reassessing her as she spoke, his expression shifting from protective concern to something approaching respect. The breakthrough in their communication came when she began to cough violently, her body still recovering from her exposure to the cold. Esno immediately moved to help her, supporting her as the coughing fit subsided. When it was over, she looked at him and said simply, "Thank you." He repeated the phrase carefully, learning the pronunciation, and responded with what she assumed were the Apache words for the same concept. As evening approached, Esno began to demonstrate knowledge that amazed and humbled his white guest. From his carefully organized supplies, he produced a variety of medicinal plants and prepared treatments with the skill of a trained physician. He brewed different teas for different purposes, one to restore her strength, another to ease the lingering cough from her exposure, a third to help her sleep peacefully. He also began treating injuries she hadn't even realized she had sustained during her desperate flight through the forest. Her hands and feet showed signs of frostbite, and he applied a salve made from bear fat and pine resin that immediately eased the burning sensation. He wrapped her feet in soft rabbit fur after treating them, ensuring that the healing process would continue while she rested. Most remarkably, he seemed to understand her concern about her father's illness. Through their evolving communication system, she had managed to convey that her father was suffering from fever and weakness. Esno nodded knowingly and began selecting specific plants and powders from his supplies. He showed her how to prepare them and, through gestures, indicated that these medicines could help with the symptoms she had described. The implication was clear. He was not only offering to help her return to her father, but was providing her with the means to treat his illness. This level of generosity from a complete stranger, especially one from a people she had been taught to fear, challenged everything she thought she knew about the world. As the storm continued to rage outside their shelter, Esno began making preparations for the journey that would be necessary once the weather cleared. He showed Abigail how to pack supplies efficiently, how to layer clothing for maximum warmth, and how to recognize signs of changing weather patterns. These were lessons that could save her life, not just on the upcoming journey, but in all her future years in the wilderness. He also began teaching her basic survival skills that white settlers rarely learned. How to find shelter using natural materials, how to start a fire in wet conditions, how to identify edible plants and avoid poisonous ones. She was a quick learner, and he found himself impressed by her intelligence and determination. This was not the helpless, hysterical white woman that some of his people described from their encounters with settlers. Most importantly, he began preparing her psychologically for what lay ahead. The journey back to her cabin would be dangerous even after the storm passed. The snow would be deep, the terrain treacherous, and her father's condition might have deteriorated further during her absence. She would need to be strong, both physically and mentally, to handle whatever they might find. As the second night in the cave approached, both Abigail and Esno realized that their brief time together had fundamentally changed them both. She had discovered that survival in the wilderness required not just courage but wisdom, and that wisdom could come from unexpected sources. He had found that the white settlers were not all the same, that some possessed the same virtues of determination and resilience that his people valued most highly. The fire burned low as they settled in for another night, but the warmth between them had grown beyond what any flame could provide. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and difficult decisions, but tonight they were simply two human beings who had found safety and understanding in the most unlikely of circumstances. The storm's fury finally began to subside on the third morning, its howling winds diminishing to gentle whispers through the pine branches. Esno had been awake since before dawn, reading the subtle signs that told him the weather was finally turning in their favor. The quality of light filtering through the cave entrance had changed from the gray oppression of the blizzard to the brighter glow that promised clear skies ahead. Abigail woke to find him preparing for departure with the methodical precision of a military campaign. Every item was being carefully selected and packed, with nothing left to chance. His movements were different now, more urgent, and she could sense that he understood the critical nature of their mission. Her father had been alone for 3 days, weakened by fever and without food. Every hour of delay could be the difference between rescue and tragedy. "Today we go," Esno said in his careful English, pointing toward the cave entrance where pale sunlight was beginning to penetrate the gloom. He had been practicing more words during the night, preparing for the complex communication that would be necessary during their journey. "Father, help, Father." The weight of what lay ahead settled on Abigail's shoulders like a physical burden. She was about to trust her life, and more importantly her father's life, to a man she had known for less than 3 days. A man whose people were considered enemies by most of the white settlers in the territory. Yet as she watched him carefully organizing supplies and checking his equipment, she realized she had never felt safer or more confident about a difficult undertaking. Esno's preparations revealed the depth of knowledge required to survive in the high country during winter. He showed Abigail how to use pine boughs tied to her feet as makeshift snowshoes, demonstrating the proper technique for walking on deep powder without sinking. He taught her to read the snow itself, identifying which patches were stable and which might give way beneath her weight. The packing of supplies was a lesson in efficiency and survival priorities. Food came first: concentrated pemmican made from dried meat and fat, pine nut cakes that provided quick energy, and dried berries that would help prevent the weakness that came from eating only meat. Medicine was equally important: the herbs and preparations he had selected for her father's fever, along with emergency treatments for injuries that might occur during the treacherous journey. Most crucial were the tools for making fire and shelter. Esno carried multiple methods for creating flame: flint and steel wrapped in waterproof leather, a fire bow set made from the driest wood, and even a small metal mirror that could focus sunlight into intense heat. He explained through gestures that fire was life in the mountains, and redundancy was the difference between survival and death. He also prepared her psychologically for what they might encounter. Using their evolving system of communication, he described the various dangers they would face: unstable snow that could trigger avalanches, ice-covered rocks that could cause fatal falls, and the ever-present threat of predators drawn by the scent of weakness and desperation. But he also showed her how his people had learned to move through this landscape safely, becoming part of the mountain rather than fighting against it. As they began their journey, Abigail discovered that traveling with Esno was like having a personal interpreter for the language of the wilderness. Every broken branch, every disturbed patch of snow, Every subtle change in the wind's direction carried information that he could read as easily as she might read words on a page. He showed her how to identify game trails that would provide easier passage through the forest, explaining through gestures and simple words how animals naturally chose the most efficient routes through difficult terrain. These ancient paths, worn smooth by countless hooves and paws over generations, often provided the safest passage for human travelers as well. The tracking skills he demonstrated were beyond anything Abigail had imagined possible. He could tell from a single footprint not just what kind of animal had passed, but when, in which direction it was traveling, and whether it had been hunting or fleeing. He pointed out sign that was completely invisible to her eyes: a single bent grass blade, a stone displaced from its natural position, the faint scent of musk lingering in the cold air. Most remarkably, he seemed to navigate without any of the tools she considered essential. While she relied on her father's compass and crude map, Esno read direction from the moss patterns on tree trunks, the way snow accumulated on different sides of rocks, and subtle variations in the quality of light that filtered through the forest canopy. His navigation was so precise that she began to suspect he could find his way blindfolded through these mountains. The physical demands of their journey tested every limit of Abigail's strength and determination. The makeshift snowshoes helped, but walking through deep powder was still exhausting work that left her legs burning and her lungs gasping for the thin mountain air. Esno set a steady pace that pushed her to her limits without breaking her completely, somehow sensing exactly how much she could endure. When she began to stumble from fatigue, he called for rest stops at carefully chosen locations that provided both shelter from the wind and strategic views of the terrain ahead. During these breaks, he shared small amounts of the concentrated food he carried, feeding her energy in precise doses that kept her strength up without overloading her stress system. The psychological challenges were as demanding as the physical ones. The landscape was vast and alien, stretching endlessly in all directions without any familiar landmarks to provide comfort or orientation. Several times, Abigail felt waves of panic as she realized how completely dependent she was on her Apache guide. If something happened to him, she would be lost in minutes and dead within hours. But Esno seemed to understand her fears and worked constantly to build her confidence. He taught her to recognize the landmarks he was using for navigation, pointing out distinctive rock formations and unusual trees that would help her find her way if they became separated. He also began teaching her emergency procedures: how to build a hasty shelter, how to signal for help, how to survive alone if the worst happened. The wilderness they traveled through was far from empty. Esno's keen senses detected the presence of other creatures long before Abigail was aware of them, and he taught her to read the subtle signs that indicated whether nearby animals posed a threat or could be safely ignored. They encountered a pack of wolves following a parallel course through the forest, the predators keeping pace with them for over an hour without showing themselves directly. Esno explained through gestures that the wolves were simply curious, not hunting, and that maintaining calm confidence would prevent the situation from escalating into danger. His relaxed demeanor gradually eased Abigail's terror, and she began to appreciate the magnificent beauty of the creatures rather than fearing them. More dangerous was their encounter with a territorial black bear that had been awakened from its winter sleep by the recent storm. The bear was confused and irritable, potentially unpredictable in its reactions to human presence. Esno immediately positioned himself between Abigail and the animal, moving slowly and deliberately while making soft sounds that seemed to communicate something to the bear. The confrontation lasted only minutes, but it felt like hours to Abigail. She watched in amazement as Esno seemed to negotiate with the bear, using body language and vocalizations that gradually convinced the animal they posed no threat to its territory. Finally, the bear withdrew into the deeper forest, leaving them to continue their journey with a new understanding of how much skill was required to survive in this wild country. As they traveled, Abigail began to understand that Esno's decision to help her went beyond simple humanitarian impulse. Through their improving communication, she learned that he had lost his own father to illness the previous winter, a death that might have been prevented if proper medicine had been available. Her desperate love for her dying father resonated with his own recent grief. He also revealed, gradually and carefully, that relations between his people and the white settlers had been deteriorating rapidly. Young warriors in his band were calling for raids against the homesteads, arguing that the encroaching settlers represented an existential threat to Apache survival. By helping her, Snow was making a statement about the possibility of peaceful coexistence, though he was taking significant personal risk in doing so. The political implications of their alliance became clear as they encountered evidence of recent violence in the area. They passed the burned remains of a settler's cabin, destroyed in what appeared to be a recent raid. Snow's reaction to the scene was complex, showing neither approval nor condemnation, but a deep sadness at the cycle of violence that seemed to be consuming both peoples. He also showed her Apache graves that had been desecrated by white settlers, sacred sites that had been damaged or destroyed by people who didn't understand their significance. Through their painful conversations, Abigail began to grasp the depth of misunderstanding and mutual fear that was driving both sides toward an apparently inevitable war. By late afternoon, they had covered most of the distance to Abigail's cabin, though the final approach would be the most dangerous part of their journey. The terrain became steeper and more exposed, with less forest cover to provide shelter from wind and observation. Snow's behavior changed subtly, becoming more alert and cautious as they entered territory where they might encounter other white settlers. He also began preparing her for what they might find at the cabin. Using their gesture-based communication system, he tried to explain that her father's condition might have deteriorated significantly during her absence. He showed her how to check for vital signs, how to assess the severity of fever, and how to administer the medicines he was carrying. The lessons were sobering reminders of how precarious her father's situation had become. More difficult was the conversation about what would happen after they reached the cabin. Snow made it clear that he could not remain in the area for long without risking discovery by other settlers or members of his own band who might not approve of his actions. But he also indicated that he would not abandon them until he was certain they were safe and her father was recovering. The final mile of their journey took them through terrain that was familiar to Abigail, but appeared completely different under its blanket of snow. Landmarks she had known since childhood were transformed into alien shapes, and several times she had to rely on Snow's navigation skills to stay on course toward what should have been familiar ground. As they crested the final ridge above her family's homestead, Abigail's heart nearly stopped. The cabin was almost completely buried in snow, with only the chimney and a small portion of the roof visible above the white drifts. No smoke rose from the chimney, and there were no signs of life around the building. After 3 days of desperate travel, they might have arrived too late. Snow immediately took charge of the situation, his training and experience overriding the emotional paralysis that threatened to overwhelm Abigail. He began digging toward the cabin door with methodical efficiency, using a broad piece of bark as an improvised shovel. The snow was packed solid by wind and time, requiring careful technique to avoid causing a collapse that might bury them as they worked together to clear the entrance, Abigail found herself praying to every deity she had ever heard mentioned, bargaining with forces beyond her understanding for her father's life. The physical work helped channel her anxiety into constructive action, but every moment of delay felt like a betrayal of the man who had raised her and taught her to survive in this harsh country. When they finally broke through to the cabin door, it opened inward with a groan of protest from hinges stiffened by cold. The interior was dark and silent, filled with air so cold it seemed to burn their lungs. Snow immediately began preparing to build a fire while Abigail rushed toward the cot where she had left her father 3 days earlier. Thomas Carson was still alive, but barely. His breathing was shallow and irregular, his skin pale and cold. To the touch, the fever that had been consuming him seemed to have burned itself out, leaving behind a weakened shell of the strong man who had brought his family to Colorado territory with such hope and determination. But he was alive, and that meant there was still a chance to save him. Snow moved into action with the same methodical precision he had shown throughout their journey. Within minutes, he had a fire blazing in the stone hearth, beginning the process of warming the cabin's frozen interior. He immediately began preparing the medicines he had brought, starting with a warming broth that would help restore Thomas's strength while delivering healing herbs directly to his system. As Abigail knelt beside her father's cot, holding his cold hand and whispering words of encouragement, she realized that the real test of Snow's commitment was just beginning. Saving her in the wilderness had been an act of spontaneous compassion. But staying to help heal her father, risking discovery and potential violence from other settlers, would be a deliberate choice that could change all their lives forever. Thomas Carson's condition was worse than even Snow's experienced eyes had anticipated. The fever had broken, but it had left behind a body so weakened that each breath seemed like it might be his last. His pulse was barely detectable. His skin had taken on the waxy pallor that Apache medicine men recognized as the spirit's preparation to depart from the flesh. Most alarming were his eyes, which remained closed even when Abigail spoke directly to him, suggesting that his consciousness had retreated to some deep place where voices from the waking world could no longer reach. Snow immediately began the most complex healing ritual he had ever attempted without the guidance of his tribal elders. Working by firelight in the cramped cabin, he transformed the humble settler dwelling into something approaching a sacred healing lodge. He burned specific combinations of sage, cedar, and sweetgrass, filling the air with smoke that carried both medicinal properties and spiritual significance. The aromatic clouds seemed to cleanse not just the stale air of the long-sealed cabin, but the atmosphere of despair that had settled over the dying man. The medicines he prepared were drawn from knowledge passed down through generations of Apache healers, each remedy precisely calibrated for Thomas's specific symptoms and condition. A tea brewed from willow bark and pine needles would help reduce any lingering fever and ease the pain that racked his weakened body. A poultice made from crushed bearberry leaves and rendered animal fat would be applied to his chest to help clear his lungs of the congestion that made each breath a struggle. Most importantly, a concentrated broth containing every strengthening herb in Snow's collection would be administered drop by drop to rebuild the vital energy that fever had consumed. Abigail watched in fascination and growing hope as the Apache healer worked with hands that seemed to know exactly what they were doing. Every movement was purposeful and confident, suggesting years of training and experience that she was only now beginning to appreciate. This was not the savage warrior that frontier stories had taught her to fear, but a skilled physician whose knowledge of healing rivaled anything she had ever seen from the traveling doctors who occasionally visited the territory. As Snow worked, he began to share fragments of the healing wisdom that guided his actions. Using their evolving communication system of words, gestures, and drawings, he explained how his people understood the relationship between physical illness and spiritual imbalance. Sickness was not just a failure of the body, but a disruption in the harmony between a person and the natural world that sustained all life. He showed her how to read the subtle signs that indicated whether a treatment was working. The quality of breathing, the temperature and moisture of the skin, the way the body responded to touch and movement, all of these carried information about the patient's condition and the effectiveness of various remedies. It was a diagnostic system far more sophisticated than anything she had learned from the folk medicine practiced by frontier families. Most remarkably, he began teaching her the treatments themselves, patiently demonstrating how to prepare each medicine and explaining its purpose through their shared vocabulary. This was knowledge that Apache healers typically guarded closely, sharing it only with selected apprentices after years of testing and preparation. Yet here he was, freely offering this precious wisdom to a white woman he had known for less than a week. The generosity of his teaching went beyond mere medical techniques. He was sharing the philosophical foundation that made Apache healing so effective. The understanding that true health required harmony between the individual, the community, and the natural world. Illness was often a sign that this balance had been disrupted, and healing required addressing not just physical symptoms, but the underlying spiritual and social causes of disease. For the next 18 hours, Esno and Abigail maintained a constant vigil beside Thomas's bedside, monitoring his condition and adjusting treatments as his body responded to their interventions. It was exhausting work that required both physical endurance and emotional resilience. As they watched for signs of improvement that were often frustratingly subtle and slow to appear, the cabin became a world unto itself, insulated from the outside reality by the intensity of their shared purpose. Time seemed to move differently within those log walls, measured not by the passage of hours, but by the rhythm of Thomas's breathing and the gradual changes in his condition. Abigail found herself entering a state of heightened awareness where every sound, every shift in temperature, every variation in the quality of light carried significance. Esno's stamina amazed her. He seemed to require no sleep, remaining alert and responsive throughout the long night as he monitored their patient and adjusted treatments. When she dozed fitfully in her chair, exhausted by days of travel and emotional stress, he continued his careful work, checking pulse and breathing, administering medicines, and maintaining the healing fires that kept the cabin warm and filled with medicinal smoke. But it was more than just physical endurance that sustained him through the long vigil. Abigail began to understand that for Esno, this healing work was a sacred duty that connected him to the deepest values of his people. Apache culture placed enormous importance on the obligation to help those in need, regardless of tribal affiliation or potential personal cost. By healing her father, he was honoring principles that had guided his ancestors for countless generations. The first sign of improvement came near dawn of the second day, when Thomas's breathing became noticeably deeper and more regular. His pulse, while still weak, had gained strength and consistency that suggested his body was beginning to respond to treatment. Most encouragingly, his skin had started to regain some of its natural color, losing the deathly pallor that had made him look like a man already halfway to the grave. Esno immediately recognized the significance of these changes, though he was careful not to let premature optimism override his clinical judgment. He adjusted the treatment regimen, reducing some of the more intensive interventions while maintaining the steady administration of strengthening medicines. This was a critical phase where the wrong decision could still result in a relapse that might prove fatal. For Abigail, watching her father slowly return from the edge of death was like witnessing a miracle. She had prepared herself for the worst during their desperate journey through the mountains, trying to accept the possibility that she might arrive too late to save the man who had raised her and taught her to survive in the wilderness. Seeing him respond to Esno's treatments filled her with a gratitude so profound it threatened to overwhelm her completely. But the Apache healer cautioned her against excessive celebration. Through gestures and simple words, he explained that recovery from severe illness was often a gradual process with setbacks and complications. Thomas was responding well to treatment, but he would need careful monitoring and continued medical support for many days before they could be confident he was truly out of danger. Late on the second afternoon, Thomas Carson finally opened his eyes with full awareness for the first time since Abigail's return. His gaze found his daughter's face first, and she saw relief and love flood his features as he realized she was safe and had returned to him. But then his eyes moved to take in the rest of the cabin, and his expression changed dramatically when he saw the Apache warrior kneeling beside his bedside. The moment was fraught with potential danger. Thomas Carson was a man of his time and place. shaped by the prejudices and fears that governed relations between white settlers and native peoples. His first instinct upon seeing an armed Indian in his cabin was to reach for the rifle that normally lay beside his bed. When his weakened body failed to respond to his mental commands, confusion and panic began to cloud his features. Abigail immediately moved to prevent a catastrophic misunderstanding, placing herself between her father and Esno while speaking rapidly to explain the situation. "Papa, this is Esno. He saved my life in the blizzard, and he's been healing you for the past 2 days. Without him, we would both be dead." Her words carried the ring of absolute truth, but she could see her father struggling to reconcile this reality with everything he had been taught about Indians. Esno, sensing the delicate nature of the moment, slowly moved his hands away from his weapons and assumed a posture that clearly communicated peaceful intentions. He spoke softly in Apache, then switched to his limited English, saying simply, "Help, daughter. Help, father. No hurt." His voice carried a dignity and sincerity that even Thomas's prejudiced expectations could not entirely dismiss. What followed was one of the most remarkable conversations in the history of relations between Apache and white settlers in Colorado Territory. Limited by language barriers and cultural differences, yet united by Thomas's obvious debt to the man who had saved both his daughter and his life, the three people slowly began to build a bridge of understanding across the chasm that typically separated their peoples. Thomas's military experience had taught him to assess men by their actions rather than their appearances, and the evidence of Esno's character was overwhelming. The Apache warrior had not only rescued his daughter from certain death, but had risked his own safety to bring her home, and then had spent 2 days using his own precious medicines to heal a complete stranger. These were the actions of a man of honor, regardless of the color of his skin or the culture that had shaped him. As Thomas's strength gradually returned, facilitated by Esno's continued medical care, he began asking questions about Apache life and customs. His curiosity was partly practical, understanding the people who lived in the same territory could be valuable for survival, but it was also genuinely human. He was discovering that the savage who had saved his family was actually a thoughtful, intelligent man with his own complex understanding of the world. Esno, in turn, began to share more details about his people's way of life, their connection to the land, and their growing concerns about the influx of white settlers. Through Abigail's translation and their improving direct communication, he painted a picture of Apache society that was far more sophisticated and reasonable than the stereotypes that dominated frontier thinking. These were not mindless raiders, but people with their own families, traditions, and legitimate concerns about survival. As Thomas's recovery progressed, Esno made a decision that would have profound implications for all their futures. He began teaching both father and daughter the healing techniques he had used to save Thomas's life, sharing knowledge that could help them survive future medical emergencies in their isolated homestead. This was an unprecedented gift as such. Medical wisdom was normally guarded closely within Apache society. The lessons covered everything from the identification and preparation of medicinal plants to the diagnosis and treatment of common frontier ailments. Esno showed them which herbs could reduce fever, which could ease pain, which could fight infection, and which could restore strength after illness or injury. He also taught them the spiritual aspects of healing, explaining how the Apache understanding of harmony between body and spirit could enhance the effectiveness of physical treatments. For Abigail, these teachings represented far more than medical knowledge. They were proof of the profound respect and trust that had developed between her and the Apache healer during their shared ordeal. Esno was not just helping them survive. He was making them part of an ancient tradition of healing that connected them to the wisdom of countless generations. Thomas, despite his initial prejudices, found himself deeply impressed by the sophistication of Apache medical knowledge. These techniques were often more effective than the folk remedies practiced by white settlers, and they were based on centuries of careful observation and experimentation. He began to understand that his people could learn much from the native inhabitants of this territory, if they could overcome their fear and prejudice long enough to listen. But even as understanding grew within the cabin, the outside world continued to present dangers that threatened to destroy the fragile peace they had created. On the third day of Thomas's recovery, Esno's keen senses detected signs that other people were moving through the area. Tracks in the snow and other subtle indicators suggested that both white settlers and Apache warriors were active in the Fayetteville region, potentially searching for the missing members of their respective communities. The implications were sobering for all three occupants of the cabin. If white settlers discovered an Apache warrior in the Carson home, they would likely assume the worst and react with violence before asking questions. Similarly, if Esno's own people found him providing aid to white settlers, he could face accusations of betraying his tribe's interests during a time of increasing tension between the two peoples. Esno began making preparations to leave. Though it was clear that the decision caused him considerable internal conflict, Thomas was recovering well but was still far from full strength, and there were aspects of his treatment that would need to continue for several more days to ensure complete recovery. Leaving prematurely could jeopardize all the progress they had made, but staying much longer could result in discovery and potentially violent confrontation. As they discussed the situation, using their now sophisticated system of multilingual communication, all three realized they had reached a crossroads that would determine not just their personal futures, but potentially the relationship between their peoples. The bond they had forged in the crucible of life and death crisis had created something unprecedented. Genuine friendship and mutual respect between representatives of two cultures that were supposedly destined for eternal conflict. On the evening before Esno's planned departure, as Thomas sat up in bed for the first time since his daughter's return, the three unlikely allies made a pact that would echo through the generations. They would maintain their friendship and mutual support regardless of what happened in the larger conflict between their peoples. More importantly, they would serve as living proof that understanding and cooperation were possible between Apache and white settlers. Esno presented Thomas with a beautifully crafted medicine bundle containing samples of all the healing herbs he had used during the treatment, along with detailed instructions for their preparation and use. It was a gift beyond price, representing not just practical medical knowledge, but a sacred trust between healers that transcended cultural boundaries. Thomas, in return, offered Esno something equally valuable, a standing invitation to consider the Carson homestead as a place of sanctuary where he would always be welcome, regardless of the political situation between their peoples. It was an offer that carried enormous risk for the Carson family, but it was also a tangible demonstration of the gratitude and respect they felt for the man who had given them back their lives, as they prepared for what might be their final night together. All three understood that they had experienced something extraordinary. In a world increasingly divided by fear, prejudice, and violence, they had discovered that individual human beings could still choose understanding over hatred, cooperation over conflict, and hope over despair. The fire that Esno had lit to save Abigail's life in the cave had become something much larger, a beacon of possibility in a dark and troubled time. Dawn brought more than just sunlight to the Carson homestead. It brought the sound of horses moving through the snow-laden forest, their hoofbeats muffled but unmistakable to Esno's trained ears. He had been preparing to leave since before first light, carefully packing his belongings and erasing as much evidence of his presence as possible. But the approaching riders meant his departure window had closed. Discovery was now inevitable, and the next few hours would determine whether the fragile bond forged between three people would survive the brutal realities of frontier politics. From his position at the cabin's single window, Esno counted at least 6 mounted men making their way through the forest toward the homestead. Their movement patterns and the way they spread out as they approached suggested they were experienced frontiersmen, possibly members of the territorial militia that had been organized to deal with what officials called the Indian problem. These were not casual visitors but men on a mission, and their intentions were unlikely to be peaceful. Thomas Carson, still weak from his illness but alert enough to understand the gravity of their situation, struggled to sit up in his bed. "How many?" he asked quietly, his voice carrying the calm authority of a man who had faced danger before during his military service. When Esno held up 6 fingers, Thomas nodded grimly and began giving instructions that could mean the difference between life and death for all of them. Abigail felt her heart racing as she realized that everything they had built over the past week was about to be tested by forces beyond their control. The understanding, trust, and genuine friendship that had developed between her family and Esno meant nothing to men who saw the world only in terms of us versus them. In their eyes, any white settler who harbored an Apache was a traitor, and any Apache found in a settler's home was automatically assumed to be hostile. The leader of the approaching group was Captain William Morrison, a career soldier whose reputation for dealing harshly with native peoples had made him a controversial figure even among other frontier military men. Morrison had lost his brother in an Apache raid 2 years earlier, and that personal tragedy had transformed his professional duty into a personal crusade. He saw no distinction between hostile warriors and peaceful Indians, believing that the only solution to the territory's problems was the complete removal or elimination of all native peoples. Morrison's men shared their leader's hardline views, though their motivations varied from genuine fear based on personal experiences to simple racial prejudice reinforced by years of frontier propaganda. They had been tracking reports of Apache activity in the area for several days, following a trail that had led them inevitably to the Carson homestead. The discovery of clear evidence that Indians had been present in the vicinity had convinced them they were closing in on a hostile war party. What they didn't know, and would likely refuse to believe even if told, was that the Apache sign they had been following represented not a raiding party, but a mission of mercy. Esno's efforts to help Abigail and heal her father had left traces that skilled trackers could follow. But the story those traces told was far different from the narrative of violence and hostility that Morrison's men expected to find. As the riders drew closer to the cabin, their body language and the way they checked their weapons made it clear they were prepared for immediate combat. Morrison had briefed them to expect resistance, possibly including white settlers who had been taken captive or coerced into cooperation. The possibility that the Carsons might be willing participants in whatever arrangement existed with local Apache groups had not seriously been considered. With discovery imminent and no possibility of Esno escaping undetected, Thomas Carson made a decision that would either save all their lives or doom them all. Drawing on reserves of strength he didn't know he still possessed, he struggled out of bed and began putting on his old army uniform, the blue wool coat and brass buttons. That identified him as a veteran of federal military service. If he was going to face down a territorial militia unit, he would do it as a former officer who outranked their captain. "Abigail," he said quietly, his voice carrying the authority of a military commander despite his physical weakness. "You're going to tell them that Esno is here under my personal protection as a military asset. You're going to say that he's been providing intelligence about Apache movements, and that any interference with this arrangement would compromise ongoing federal operations in the territory." The plan was desperate and full of holes, but it was their only chance to avoid a violent confrontation that would almost certainly end with Esno's death and possible charges of treason against the Carson family. Thomas was gambling that his military credentials would carry enough weight to make Morrison's men hesitate long enough to hear a reasonable explanation for the situation they were about to discover. Esno, understanding the essence of the plan even through the language barriers that still complicated their communication, began his own preparations. He removed his war paint and traditional decorations, adopting a more neutral appearance that might seem less threatening to the approaching soldiers. More importantly, he positioned his weapons where they would be visible, but not immediately accessible, demonstrating that he was not preparing for combat. Captain Morrison's voice boomed across the homestead clearing as his men surrounded the cabin with military precision. "Thomas Carson, come out with your hands visible. We have reason to believe you're harboring hostile Indians, and we're prepared to take whatever action is necessary to resolve this situation." The ultimatum carried the weight of official authority, but it also revealed Morrison's willingness to use violence against fellow white settlers if he deemed it necessary. Thomas Carson emerged from his cabin wearing his uniform and moving with as much dignity as his weakened condition would allow. The sight of the blue wool and brass buttons had an immediate effect on Morrison's men, several of whom were themselves Army veterans who recognized the symbols of federal military authority. For a moment, the dynamic of the confrontation shifted from civilian law enforcement to a meeting between military officers. "Captain Morrison," Thomas said, his voice carrying across the clearing with surprising strength. "I'm Colonel Thomas Carson, retired, formerly of the 5th Infantry Regiment. The person you're looking for is indeed present on my property, but he's here under federal protection as part of an intelligence operation that I'm not at liberty to discuss in detail." With territorial militia, the claim was bold enough to give Morrison pause, though his expression showed he was far from convinced. Military intelligence operations were common enough on the frontier, and federal authorities often worked with local native informants to gather information about hostile tribes. But the idea that such an operation would be conducted by a retired officer at an isolated homestead seemed highly irregular. Morrison dismounted and approached the cabin with his hand resting on his sidearm, his eyes scanning for any sign of deception or threat. "Colonel Carson," he said, emphasizing the title with obvious skepticism, "if what you're telling me is true, you'll have documentation to support these claims. Federal intelligence operations require proper authorization, and I have the authority to inspect any such documents." This was the moment Thomas had been dreading, because of course there were no documents to support his fabricated story. But he had spent enough years in the Army to know how military bureaucracy worked, and he used that knowledge to buy precious time. "Captain, you know as well as I do that intelligence operations require strict security protocols. I can't produce sensitive documents for inspection by territorial militia without proper clearance from federal authorities." While this verbal sparring continued, Abigail was playing her own crucial role in the deception. She presented herself as a dutiful daughter concerned only with her father's health, explaining how his recent illness had required her to seek help from any available source. Her genuine gratitude toward Esno for saving both their lives came across as convincing evidence that whatever arrangement existed between her family and the Apache warrior was based on mutual benefit rather than coercion. Esno himself remained silent during most of the confrontation, understanding instinctively that his best contribution was to appear calm, non-threatening, and completely under the control of the white settlers who were vouching for him. His dignified bearing and obvious intelligence made it difficult for Morrison's men to see him as the savage warrior their propaganda had led them to expect. The standoff reached its critical point when one of Morrison's men claimed to recognize Esno as a warrior who had participated in raids against white settlements. The accusation could have shattered the fragile protection that Thomas's military reputation was providing, potentially justifying immediate violent action against all three occupants of the homestead. But Thomas Carson's years of military service had taught him how to handle crisis situations where quick thinking could mean the difference between life and death. "Sergeant," he said, addressing the accuser with the voice of command, "if this man had been raiding settlements, he wouldn't be sitting peacefully in my cabin providing information about his people's movements. He'd be running for his life through the mountains with a price on his head." The logic was sound enough to create doubt in the minds of Morrison's men. but it wasn't sufficient to completely dispel their suspicions. The captain continued to probe for weaknesses in the story, asking detailed questions about the supposed intelligence operation and demanding explanations for inconsistencies in the Carson family's account of recent events. It was Abigail who provided the crucial breakthrough that finally convinced Morrison to stand down. Speaking with the passionate sincerity of someone telling the absolute truth, she described her near-death experience in the blizzard and Esno's role in saving her life. Her account was so vivid and emotionally compelling that even Morrison's hardened soldiers found themselves moved by the story of human compassion transcending cultural boundaries. Morrison's decision to withdraw his men without taking action against Esno came at a significant cost for all parties involved. The captain made it clear that he was not entirely convinced by the explanations he had received, and that he would be monitoring the situation closely for any signs of deception or betrayal. This meant that the Carson homestead would be under constant surveillance, with any unusual activity likely to trigger a return visit under much less favorable circumstances. For Esno, the confrontation had revealed the impossible position he occupied in the growing conflict between his people and the white settlers. His actions in helping the Carson family had been motivated by basic humanity and personal honor, but they had also placed him under suspicion from both communities. Apache warriors would question his loyalty if they learned of his cooperation with whites, while white settlers would never fully trust him regardless of his peaceful intentions. The agreement that finally ended the standoff required Esno to report regularly to territorial authorities about Apache movements and activities in the region. It was a role that transformed him from a free warrior into something approaching a government informant, a compromise that satisfied neither his own sense of honor nor the security concerns of the white community. Thomas Carson understood that his deception had purchased temporary safety at the cost of permanent complications. He was now committed to maintaining the fiction of a federal intelligence operation, which meant regular contact with territorial authorities and constant vigilance to prevent the discovery of his lies. The quiet retirement he had sought in the Colorado mountains had been replaced by a life of careful political maneuvering. Despite the external pressures and compromises forced upon them by the confrontation with Morrison's militia, the fundamental relationship between Thomas, Abigail, and Esno remained strong. The shared experience of facing down potentially deadly opposition had, if anything, strengthened the bonds of trust and mutual respect that had developed during Thomas's illness and recovery. In the days following Morrison's departure, they worked together to establish a sustainable arrangement that would allow their friendship to continue while satisfying the demands of outside authorities. Esno's regular visits to the homestead were now officially justified as intelligence briefings, but they continued to serve their original purpose of sharing knowledge, providing mutual support, and maintaining the human connections that had saved all their lives. The healing knowledge that Esno had shared with the Carson family took on new significance in this changed environment. Thomas and Abigail found themselves serving as informal medical practitioners for other settler families in the area, using Apache techniques to treat illnesses and injuries conventional frontier medicine could not address effectively. This service to their community helped establish their credibility and made their association with Esno appear more legitimate to suspicious neighbors. More importantly, their success in healing others began to change attitudes about native peoples and their knowledge. Families who had been helped by Apache medical techniques found it harder to maintain stereotypes about savage primitives who had nothing to offer civilized society. Slowly and quietly, the Carson homestead became a bridge between two worlds that had seemed destined for eternal conflict. But even as individual relationships improved and understanding grew within their small circle, the larger political situation continued to deteriorate. Reports of violence between Apache bands and white settlers increased throughout the territory, with each incident further polarizing the communities and making moderate voices harder to hear. The space for compromise and peaceful coexistence was shrinking rapidly as fear and anger overwhelmed reason on both sides. Snow brought increasingly disturbing news about the mood within Apache communities, where young warriors were gaining influence by calling for all-out war against the white invaders. The patience of tribal elders who favored negotiation and accommodation was being exhausted by the steady encroachment on traditional lands and the failure of peaceful approaches to protect Apache interests. Similarly, white settlers were organizing more aggressive responses to what they perceived as an escalating threat to their safety and prosperity. Militia units were being expanded and armed with better weapons, while territorial authorities discussed plans for forcible removal of all native peoples from areas designated for white settlement. The moderate voices calling for peaceful coexistence were being drowned out by demands for decisive military action. Thomas Carson found himself in the impossible position of trying to serve as a bridge between two communities that were increasingly committed to destroying each other. His intelligence reports to territorial authorities had to be carefully crafted to provide useful information while protecting Snow and other peaceful Apache individuals from retaliation. It was a delicate balancing act that grew more difficult with each passing week, as winter gave way to spring and the mountain passes cleared for increased travel and commerce. All three members of their unlikely alliance understood that they were approaching a moment of final decision. The comfortable arrangement they had maintained during the isolated winter months would not survive the increased scrutiny and activity that warmer weather would bring to the territory. Snow faced the choice between maintaining his connection to the Carson family and rejoining his own people as they prepared for what many believed would be the final conflict with white settlers. His unique position as someone trusted by both communities gave him opportunities to influence events, but it also made him a target for extremists on both sides who saw moderation as betrayal. For Thomas and Abigail Carson, the approaching spring meant decisions about whether to remain in territory that was becoming increasingly dangerous for anyone associated with native peoples, or to abandon the homestead they had worked so hard to build and seek safety in more settled regions, where their association with Snow would not mark them as traitors to their own race. The fire that had saved Abigail's life in the mountain cave had become something much larger and more complex than any of them had anticipated. It had illuminated not just the possibility of friendship across cultural boundaries, but also the terrible costs that such friendship might require in a world determined to choose sides rather than seek understanding. Spring brought with it a crisis that would test every bond they had forged through their winter of shared survival. Word reached the Carson homestead that a wagon train of settlers had been attacked just 20 miles north, with 7 dead and 3 missing. The territorial governor had declared martial law and authorized Captain Morrison to use whatever force necessary to end the Apache threat permanently. More devastating still, Snow brought news that his own war chief had branded him a traitor and issued a death sentence for any Apache warrior found cooperating with white authorities. The safe haven they had created was collapsing from both directions. Thomas could no longer maintain his fiction of a federal intelligence operation, as Morrison's expanded authority meant immediate military occupation of all strategic points in the territory. Snow could not return to his people without facing execution, yet staying would make him a perpetual fugitive hunted by both Apache warriors and white soldiers. The impossible had become inevitable. They would have to choose between their friendship and their lives. Abigail stood at the cabin window, watching smoke rise from signal fires in the distant mountains, knowing that each column of smoke represented messages she could never read, but whose meaning was becoming terrifyingly clear. War was coming, real war that would consume everything in its path. The delicate balance they had maintained through winter's isolation was crumbling under the weight of forces too powerful for 3 individuals to resist. No matter how strong their bonds of loyalty and love, yet even as the walls closed in around them, none of the three was willing to abandon what they had built together. The knowledge they had shared, the lives they had saved, the understanding they had achieved across cultural boundaries, these things were too precious to sacrifice to the hatred and fear that was consuming their world. If they were to lose everything, they would lose it while standing together, rather than surrendering to the forces that demanded they become enemies. The evening that would change everything began like many others, with the three of them sitting around their fire, sharing the quiet companionship that had sustained them through the dangerous winter months. But tonight carried a weight of finality that none of them could ignore. Morrison's patrols were closing in, Apache war parties were moving through the surrounding mountains, and their window of opportunity for any kind of peaceful resolution was measured in hours rather than days. Thomas broke the silence first, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had made difficult decisions throughout his military career. "We have one chance," he said, staring into the flames that danced between them. "One opportunity to prove that what we've built here can survive in the larger world. But it will require everything we have, and there's no guarantee any of us will survive the attempt." He outlined his plan with the precision of a military operation, but the audacity of what he was proposing took even Abigail's breath away. They would arrange a formal peace council between Apache leaders and territorial authorities, using their unique position as trusted intermediaries to create something that had never been attempted in the Colorado Territory. It was either brilliant strategy or elaborate suicide, and possibly both. Esno's response revealed the depth of his commitment to their shared vision. Despite knowing that his participation would make him a permanent outcast from his own people, he agreed to serve as Apache spokesman. "My grandfather once told me," he said in his careful English, "that a man's honor is not measured by how well he serves his tribe, but by how well he serves the future. This is how I serve the future." The next weeks were a blur of dangerous activity as they worked to arrange the impossible. Thomas used every connection from his military career to reach territorial authorities, who might be willing to consider alternatives to the military solution that was rapidly consuming the region. His efforts required delicate maneuvering around Captain Morrison's increasingly restrictive security measures, as any communication with outside authorities carried the risk of exposing their entire operation. Esno faced even greater dangers. In his attempts to contact Apache elders who might be willing to participate in peace negotiations, the mountains were full of war parties hunting for the traitor who had been helping white settlers, and several times he barely escaped detection by warriors who would have killed him without hesitation. Each successful contact with potential Apache representatives required him to risk not just his own life, but the safety of the Carson family who were sheltering him. Abigail served as the crucial link between both efforts, carrying messages and maintaining communication when direct contact became too dangerous. Her role required her to travel alone through territory that was becoming increasingly violent, relying on skills Esno had taught her to move unseen through landscapes that could be fatal to anyone caught in the wrong place at the wrong time. The young woman who had once nearly died searching for food in a blizzard had become a skilled operative capable of surviving in conditions that would challenge experienced frontiersmen. The breakthrough came when Thomas's old commanding officer, now serving as a territorial judge, agreed to participate after hearing detailed accounts of the Carson family's experiences with Apache healing techniques. Judge Harrison had lost his own son to frontier violence and was desperate for any alternative to the cycle of revenge that was consuming the territory. His legal authority would give weight to any agreements reached, assuming they could find common ground for negotiation. The meeting location chosen for this unprecedented negotiation was itself symbolic of the hope they were trying to preserve. Deep in the mountains, at a natural amphitheater beside a clear spring, Apache bands had held sacred councils for generations. It was neutral ground where even enemy tribes could meet safely under the ancient laws of hospitality that governed native politics. Thomas's suggestion that territorial authorities meet Apache leaders on sacred ground was either an act of profound respect or dangerous naivety. The site itself was breathtakingly beautiful, surrounded by towering pines and granite cliffs that created a natural cathedral in the wilderness. The spring that gave the place its sacred significance emerged from deep underground sources, providing crystal clear water that Apache tradition held to be blessed by the spirits of the mountains. For countless generations, this had been a place where disputes were resolved through words rather than weapons. Preparing the site for the council required careful attention to both Apache spiritual traditions and the practical security needs of territorial officials who would be venturing into what they considered hostile territory. Esno worked with Apache elders to ensure that proper protocols were followed, while Thomas coordinated with Judge Harrison's security detail to establish protective measures that wouldn't violate the sacred nature of the location. The symbolic importance of holding the meeting on Apache sacred ground was not lost on anyone involved. It represented a fundamental shift from the usual pattern of negotiations, where native peoples were expected to come to white settlements and operate according to European American legal and cultural frameworks. This time, territorial authorities would be guests in a native sacred space, operating according to Apache traditions of council procedure. As word of the planned council spread through carefully controlled channels, the response from both communities revealed the depth of division that existed around questions of war and peace. Apache war leaders spread word that any tribal member attending peaceful negotiations was marked for death as a collaborator with the enemy. White settler militias declared that any territorial official who met with hostile savages was committing treason against American civilization. Yet despite these threats, a remarkable coalition of moderate voices began to emerge from both communities. Apache elders who had watched the steady deterioration of relations with growing alarm saw the council as possibly their last chance to avoid the complete destruction of their traditional way of life. White settlers who had grown weary of constant fear and violence recognized that military solutions had failed repeatedly and were willing to consider alternatives. The most crucial breakthrough came when Nate, an elderly Apache medicine man who commanded enormous respect throughout the tribal community, agreed to attend the council despite the objections of younger warriors. Nate had spent his entire life watching the steady encroachment of white settlement on traditional Apache lands, but he had also observed that violence had only accelerated the process of displacement and cultural destruction. Similarly, several prominent white settlers who had initially supported military action began reconsidering their positions as the human and economic costs of continued warfare mounted. Families were being destroyed by violence on both sides, and the constant state of military alert was making normal economic and social development impossible. The promise of a negotiated peace that could provide security for both communities was becoming increasingly attractive, but for every moderate voice that emerged in support of the peace initiative, extremists on both sides organized more determined opposition. Captain Morrison's response to news of the planned council was swift and brutal. He declared the entire region a military zone and announced that any Apache found in the area would be shot on sight as enemy combatants. He also placed the Carson homestead under direct military supervision, effectively making them prisoners in their own home. The situation became even more complex when a band of young Apache warriors, led by Esno's own cousin, surrounded the traditional council site and announced their intention to kill any tribal member who participated in negotiations with white authorities. The sacred ground that was supposed to provide safety for the peace talks had become the focal point for the very conflicts they were trying to resolve. White extremists proved equally determined to prevent any peaceful resolution that might legitimize Apache claims to territorial rights. Militia units from several counties organized a coordinated campaign to disrupt the council through intimidation and violence. Their declared intention was to arrest any territorial official who participated in unauthorized negotiations with hostile forces. The pressure on all three members of their alliance intensified dramatically as the date for the council approached. Thomas faced potential court-martial proceedings for his unauthorized diplomatic activities. Abigail received death threats from settler families who viewed any accommodation with Apache people as betrayal of white interests. Esno was being hunted by Apache war parties who considered him the most dangerous kind of traitor, one who understood both cultures well enough to effectively serve the enemy. Despite all the obstacles and threats, the gathering that took place at the Sacred Spring on May 15, 1881, represented the most serious attempt at peaceful resolution of the Apache Wars in Colorado Territory history. The fact that the meeting occurred at all was testament to the courage of individuals who chose principle over safety, hope over hatred, and the difficult work of peace over the temporary satisfaction of revenge. The participants who gathered in the natural amphitheater beside the Sacred Spring represented a remarkable cross-section of both communities. Apache elders sat across from territorial judges, tribal war leaders faced white militia officers, and traditional medicine men shared space with Christian ministers who had come to witness what many believed would be either a historic breakthrough or a tragic failure. Esno served as primary translator and cultural interpreter, using his unique position as someone trusted by both communities to facilitate communication that went beyond mere language differences. His role required him to explain not just words, but entire worldviews, helping each side understand the fundamental concerns and values that motivated their supposed enemies. It was the most important work of his life, and he understood that failure would mean not just personal destruction, but the collapse of any hope for peaceful coexistence. The opening ceremonies followed Apache tradition, with participants smoking a sacred pipe and making offerings to the spirits of the mountains who were believed to watch over all council proceedings. For many of the white officials present, this was their first exposure to native spiritual practices, and their respectful participation marked a significant departure from the usual patterns of cross-cultural interaction on the frontier. The negotiations themselves were unlike anything that had ever been attempted in the American West. Rather than focusing on territorial boundaries or military agreements, the discussions centered on the practical questions of how two very different peoples could share the same land without destroying each other. It was a revolutionary approach that required both sides to abandon assumptions about ultimate victory and accept the more difficult challenge of sustainable coexistence. Apache representatives, led by the elderly Nate, spoke with eloquent passion about their spiritual connection to specific sacred sites and the traditional hunting grounds that had sustained their people for countless generations. Their presentations were not merely political arguments, but profound statements about the relationship between human communities and the natural world that supported all life. Territorial officials, led by Judge Harrison, explained the economic and social pressures driving white settlement patterns while acknowledging the legitimate grievances that had led to Apache resistance. For the first time in the history of territorial administration, white authorities were formally recognizing that native peoples had valid claims and rational reasons for opposing policies that threatened their survival. Abigail's role as documenter proved crucial as the talks progressed, because her detailed records captured not just the formal agreements being reached, but the emotional and cultural breakthroughs that made those agreements possible. She recorded moments when Apache elders and white officials discovered shared concerns about protecting their children's futures, and instances when cultural differences led to new insights rather than increased hostility. The council reached its climax when Nate, speaking with the authority of generations of Apache wisdom, made an offer that stunned everyone present. He proposed the creation of a formal alliance between Apache bands and territorial authorities, based not on the subordination of one people to another, but on genuine partnership in managing the challenges facing both communities. The proposal was revolutionary in its implications, suggesting a model of coexistence that had never been attempted in the long history of conflict between native peoples and white settlers. Apache bands would retain rights to certain sacred and hunting grounds in exchange for providing assistance in controlling rogue elements on both sides who were committed to continued warfare. It was a framework that recognized the legitimate interests of both communities while creating mechanisms for resolving future disputes through negotiation rather than violence. Judge Harrison's response revealed the depth of his commitment to finding alternatives to military solutions that had already cost so much in human lives and economic resources. Speaking with the full authority of territorial law, he declared that any agreements reached at the council would be given complete legal recognition and protection by civilian courts. He also promised that territorial authorities would work actively to control white extremists who violated treaty provisions, just as Apache leaders were being asked to control their own rogue elements. The moment when formal agreements were signed represented the culmination of everything Thomas, Abigail, and Esno had worked toward since their first meeting in the mountain cave. They had proven that individual acts of courage and compassion could scale up to create genuine political change, that the bonds forged between people who chose to see each other's humanity could become the foundation for lasting peace between entire communities. But even as they celebrated their success in achieving what many had considered impossible, all three understood that the real test of their accomplishment lay ahead. Signing agreements was relatively easy compared to the challenge of implementing them in communities where extremists on both sides remained committed to violent solutions. The peace they had negotiated on paper would have to be defended every day through continued acts of courage, wisdom, and mutual respect. The personal costs of their involvement in the peace process became clear immediately after the council ended. Esno could never safely return to traditional Apache society, having been permanently branded as a traitor by the war faction that had gained control of tribal politics. His choice to serve as an intermediary had saved lives and prevented further warfare, but it had also made him a man without a people, belonging fully to neither community while serving both. Thomas faced potential court-martial proceedings for his unauthorized negotiations with forces that were still officially classified as hostile, despite the legal protection that Judge Harrison's participation provided. His military career was effectively over, but he had gained something far more valuable, the knowledge that he had helped create a genuine alternative to the cycle of violence that was destroying the frontier. Abigail found herself the target of harassment and threats from settler families who viewed any accommodation with Apache people as betrayal of white interests and racial solidarity. Women who had once been friends and neighbors now crossed the street to avoid speaking with her, and several merchants refused to serve her family. The social costs of standing for peace in a community committed to war were proving to be higher than any of them had anticipated. 1 year later, as Abigail sat by the fire in their cabin, reading from the journal she had kept throughout their extraordinary experiences, she reflected on how completely their lives had been transformed since that desperate day, when she had nearly died searching for food in a blizzard. The fire that Esno had lit to save her life had become something far greater than either of them could have imagined, a beacon of hope that had illuminated possibilities for peace that neither Apache nor white communities had believed possible. The agreements negotiated at the Sacred Council had largely held, despite continued pressure from extremists who remained committed to violent solutions. Apache bands that had joined the alliance were providing valuable assistance in tracking down rogue warriors who continued raiding activities, while territorial authorities were prosecuting white settlers who violated treaty provisions. It was an imperfect peace, challenged daily by those who preferred the clarity of warfare to the complexity of coexistence, but it was holding. Thomas had been vindicated by the success of his peace initiative, receiving commendation from federal authorities who recognized the value of civilian diplomacy in resolving conflicts that military force had failed to address effectively. He had become an unofficial ambassador between Apache and white communities, using his unique experience and credibility to mediate disputes before they could escalate into violence. His cabin had become a regular meeting place for representatives of both peoples working to build understanding across cultural boundaries. Snow had found a new role as a teacher and interpreter, sharing his knowledge of both Apache and white cultures with young people from both communities who were growing up in the new world of peaceful coexistence. His position as someone who belonged fully to neither community, but was trusted by both, made him invaluable in preparing the next generation for a future where cooperation would be more important than conflict. The story of their unlikely alliance had spread throughout the territory and beyond, inspiring other attempts at peaceful resolution of conflicts that had seemed intractable. Letters arrived regularly from other frontier regions where people were trying to apply the lessons learned at the sacred council to their own situations of seemingly irreconcilable differences. The fire of understanding that had begun in a mountain cave was spreading, carried by people who chose hope over hatred and courage over fear. As winter returned to the Colorado mountains and snow began to accumulate around their cabin, once again, Abigail understood that the fire Snow had lit to save her life would never truly be extinguished. It lived on in every act of kindness between former enemies, every moment of understanding that bridged cultural differences, every choice to build rather than destroy. The storm that had nearly killed her had become the beginning of something beautiful and lasting, proof that even in the darkest times, human beings could choose to create light rather than surrender to darkness. The fire she would never forget was not just the flames that had warmed her frozen body in that mountain cave, but the spark of human connection that had grown into a beacon of hope for all who were willing to see beyond the artificial divisions that fear and hatred had created. In a world determined to choose sides, they had chosen each other. And in that choice, they had discovered that the greatest victory was not defeating one's enemies, but transforming them into friends.
Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.